When I returned home after university, everything seemed simultaneously familiar and foreign. The house where I had grown up was the same, but something had changed. My father, Richard, after many years of solitude, had remarried. His new wife was Elizabeth, a woman several years his senior. She was already 60. Frankly, I had been unsure about this marriage from the start. It seemed odd to me that my father had chosen a woman who could have been older than him. Could there really be no ulterior motive in her intentions? When I first saw Elizabeth, my attitude towards her was cold. I didn't know how to behave or what to think about her. She was the complete opposite of the women I was used to seeing with my father. Strong, self-assured, yet her eyes reflected deep wisdom. She greeted me with a gentle smile full of kindness, as if she understood all my doubts. "I'm glad you're home, Tom," she said with such sincerity that it took me by surprise. In the first few days at home, I behaved cautiously. I tried to avoid unnecessary conversations and observed her from a distance. Elizabeth seemed attentive, caring. She always inquired about how my day went and offered help when I was trying to find a new job. Gradually, her care began to change my perception. I started to notice that I felt at ease in her presence. Every evening at dinner, Elizabeth and my father engaged in discussions on topics that always led my father into interesting reflections. They talked about books, politics, even art, and I gradually became involved in these conversations. Her intelligence and sincerity made me reconsider my attitude towards her. She was not trying to replace my mother and was not seeking attention or wealth from my father. Elizabeth was someone who genuinely loved him. One evening, sitting in the living room, we ended up alone. My father had gone out on business, and the house seemed to sink into silence. We talked about my life after university, about what I planned next. She listened attentively, not interrupting, and then said, "You're so goal-oriented, Tom. I'm sure you'll make it." Her voice was warm, and her gaze was encouraging. For the first time, I felt that some invisible bond had formed between us, but it was a strange feeling, something between admiration and embarrassment. Anxiety was growing inside me, but I couldn't understand where it was coming from. In the following days, I noticed that I thought about Elizabeth more often, not as a stepmother, but as a woman whose kindness and attention were beginning to awaken strange feelings in me. Another week passed, and the tension in the house became almost unbearable. Each day, I felt a strange attraction emanating from Elizabeth. It seemed that her presence was becoming more and more palpable. We exchanged glances, and in each one, I saw something more than just friendliness or care. There was something inexplicable burning in her eyes, and it frightened me. One evening, when my father had again gone out on business, I was taking a shower after a long day of job hunting. The water flowed down my skin, and I tried to calm my thoughts, to quell that strange feeling that had settled inside. But as soon as I heard a soft knock on the bathroom door, all inner peace crumbled. "Tom, may I come in?" Elizabeth's voice sounded calm, but I detected something else in it, something that caused me uncomfortable agitation. I stood under the flow of water, not knowing what to answer. Seconds dragged slowly, but eventually I managed to say, "Yes, of course." The door cracked open, and Elizabeth appeared in the bathroom. She was wearing a robe, but not the usual modest one she typically wore at home. This one was clearly too thin, too revealing. She stepped inside, her gaze focused on me, and at that moment, I felt the air in the room become heavy. "I need to talk to you, Tom," she began, and her voice was no longer as calm as before. "I've been thinking a lot about what's happening between us." I remained silent, not knowing how to react to her words. My heart was pounding in my throat, and a cold fear mixed with something else. A sense of guilt and a strange pull towards what I understood was wrong. "You feel it too, don't you?" Her voice was almost a whisper, but there was so much power in that whisper that I couldn't resist. She moved closer, and I saw the belt of her robe loosen. It began to slowly unravel, revealing her shoulders. There was no shame, no doubt in Elizabeth's eyes, only desire. It was like a flash. She was no longer the caring and understanding woman I was used to seeing. Standing before me was a woman who was not afraid of her desires. "Tom, I need you." Her voice trembled, not from shame but from restrained passion. "I can't pretend anymore that this isn't happening. I can't pretend." I was still standing there, stunned by what was happening, unable to believe that this was really happening. My thoughts were all jumbled, and I couldn't understand how it was that my stepmother, this mature, confident woman, had decided to cross the boundaries of propriety. She stepped forward, and now I could feel her breath on my skin. Her hands gently touched my shoulder, and the touch sent a shiver through my body. "I know you're thinking the same thing." Her voice grew more and more confident. "Don't deny it, Tom. We can be honest with each other." I knew it was wrong, knew I couldn't do that to my father. But looking at her, the woman who stood before me without a shadow of a doubt, I knew she wouldn't stop. There was no principle or modesty in her eyes, only lust. She wanted me, and it was evident in her entire appearance. My head was spinning with conflicting emotions, guilt for my father, fear of the consequences, and a sudden desire I couldn't suppress. I wanted her too, as wrong as it was. But something inside me made me take a step back as if clinging to the remnants of reason. "Elizabeth, this is wrong," I barely managed to say, struggling to get the words out. But she only stepped closer, her dressing gown now almost completely open, exposing her body. She wasn't my stepmother at that moment. In front of me was a woman with a hunger for passion that wasn't going to stop. Elizabeth stepped closer, her fingers sliding along my forearm, and suddenly she was kneeling in front of me. I froze, my mind fogged, and everything seemed unreal, like a dream I was about to wake up from. "Tom," she whispered, looking up at me, her eyes full of desire. "Let me make you feel good. We both want to." Her hands began to reach for the waistband of my dressing gown, and my breathing became frequent and heavy. All my morals were screaming at me to stop her, that this was wrong, but at the same time, something dark inside me held me in place. I didn't know what to do. My heart was beating to the beat of conflicting thoughts, passion and guilt fighting for supremacy. The seconds stretched like an eternity. I looked at Elizabeth, who was unashamedly ready to cross the line. She didn't think about the consequences, but I knew that if I let it happen, there would be no turning back. We would destroy everything between me, her, and my father. Her hands almost touched my dressing gown, and at that moment, I pulled back sharply, feeling a cold sweat run down my body. "No, Elizabeth," I said, my voice shaking, but I couldn't let this go on any longer. "We can't do this." She froze, her eyes changing instantly, fear and realization in them. She dropped her hands and then stood up, not taking her eyes off me. I'm sorry, Tom," she whispered, her voice full of shame. "I shouldn't have done that. It's wrong. I lost control. I don't know what came over me." I stood still, feeling the tension leave my body, but with it came the realization of what had happened. I knew everything had changed. Our lives would never be the same. "I think I need to talk to my dad about this," I said, sighing heavily. My heart clenched at the thought of having to face the consequences. Elizabeth covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. "No, Tom, please don't tell him," she whispered. "It would ruin everything." "But I can't keep quiet," I answered quietly with pain in my voice. "It would be wrong." Several minutes of silence passed. Elizabeth slowly stepped away from me, her gaze filled with fear and horror at the realization of what had happened. She couldn't look me in the eye, as if she was afraid of seeing disgust there. "I understand if you tell everything to your father," her voice trembled even more, "but please try to understand me. It was more than just physical attraction. I felt so lonely, and you were here, so understanding and supportive." I didn't know what to think. Everything inside me screamed of betrayal and deceit, but at the same time, deep down, I started to understand her loneliness. She had been here, in this big empty house, always waiting for my father, who was often away on business trips. Suddenly, I felt not only anger toward her, but also pity. "I'll talk to my father," I finally said, summoning the willpower. "But I don't know yet what exactly I'll tell him. We both need time to think about everything that's happened." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She silently turned and slowly headed for the door. As she passed me,